By early 1944, the Pacific War had entered a decisive new phase. The United States had broken Japan's defensive perimeter in the Central Pacific, capturing the Gilbert Islands in November 1943 and the Marshalls in February 1944. These victories provided stepping stones that brought American forces within striking distance of the Mariana Islands, a chain including Guam, Tinian, and most importantly, Saipan. Located just over 200 miles from Tokyo, Saipan was more than another island. It was a launch point for the Boeing B-29 Superfortress, a bomber capable of carrying the war directly to the Japanese mainland. The stakes were clear. If the Marianas fell, Japan's inner defenses would be breached and its cities exposed to relentless air assault. For the Imperial Japanese Navy and Army, the loss of Saipan was unthinkable, for it would sever their control over the Pacific and shatter morale both at home and abroad. It was against this backdrop that Operation Forager, the American plan to invade the Marianas, took shape. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, saw the seizure of Saipan as essential to breaking Japan's will to fight. General Holland M. Howlin' Mad Smith of the U.S. Marine Corps was tasked with commanding the amphibious assault, while Admiral Raymond Spruance's Fifth Fleet provided naval and air supremacy. On the Japanese side, Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito prepared his garrison of more than 30,000 soldiers, supported by civilians and reinforced by naval units determined to resist to the last man. Saipan, in their eyes, would be the decisive battle where Japan might halt America's unstoppable advance. In the middle of this story, let me pause for a moment. If you are passionate about learning history the way it truly unfolded, with all the strategies, sacrifices, and turning points laid bare, make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and share this documentary with others who value real history. The stage was now set. On June 13, 1944, American fast carriers launched preliminary air raids on Saipan, softening defenses and testing Japanese resolve. 3 days later, on June 15th, an enormous amphibious force, 2 Marine divisions backed by naval bombardment, moved toward the beaches of the island. The Battle of Saipan was about to begin, and with it, the fate of the Pacific War was about to change forever. On the morning of June 15, 1944, the calm blue waters off Saipan erupted into one of the most ambitious amphibious assaults of the Pacific War. Before dawn, U.S. battleships, cruisers, and destroyers unleashed a furious bombardment across the island's western shore, firing thousands of shells in an attempt to weaken Japanese fortifications. Columns of smoke and dust rose high above the beaches. Yet beneath that haze, Lieutenant General Saito's forces remained largely intact, hidden in caves, bunkers, and the dense vegetation that covered the island. The Japanese had studied the American pattern of assault since Guadalcanal and Tarawa, and they prepared to exploit every inch of Saipan's rugged terrain to bleed their enemy white. Shortly after 8:30 a.m., the first wave of U.S. Marines from the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions clambered down the sides of landing ships into waiting amphibious tractors, known as LVTs. With naval gunfire roaring behind them, the assault vehicles churned toward the shore in endless lines. The target was a 4-mile stretch of coastline near Chalan Kanoa, chosen for its relative flatness, but still heavily defended. As the Marines approached, Japanese artillery opened up, shells splashing water high into the air and ripping into landing craft. Within moments, chaos engulfed the beaches. Some units landed at the wrong spots, others found themselves pinned by machine gun nests firing from concealed positions. By midday, the scale of the challenge became evident. The initial landing had put more than 8,000 Marines ashore, but their progress inland was slow and costly. The beaches were littered with burning vehicles, wrecked LVTs, and men struggling to find cover in shallow sand. Japanese defenders counterattacked fiercely, rushing from hidden pillboxes and caves, sometimes charging with bayonets into the surf itself. For every yard gained, blood was spilled, and the toll mounted rapidly. Yet the Americans pressed on. Engineers cleared obstacles. Sherman tanks were brought ashore under heavy fire, and naval destroyers moved dangerously close to the shoreline to blast stubborn strongpoints at point-blank range. The sheer weight of American material, artillery, armor, and constant airstrikes from carrier-based planes gradually forced the defenders to yield ground. By nightfall of June 15th, a fragile beachhead had been secured, though it was shallow, narrow, and vulnerable to counterattack. On June 16th, Japanese forces attempted to throw the invaders back into the sea. Waves of infantry stormed against Marine lines in furious banzai charges, supported by tanks that rumbled forward across the broken terrain. The Marines, with artillery carefully pre-sighted and naval guns standing ready offshore, broke these attacks with devastating firepower. The ground was piled with the bodies of Japanese soldiers who had advanced with unquestioning loyalty but little chance of success. By June 17th, U.S. forces had firmly consolidated their positions and begun to push inland. The battle, however, was only beginning, and both sides knew that the struggle for Saipan would soon intensify in ways neither had fully imagined. With the beachhead secured, the next phase of the Saipan campaign began on June 18, 1944. U.S. commanders ordered their divisions to push inland, aiming to cut across the island's waist and isolate Japanese forces. The Marines faced a landscape that was both beautiful and deadly: fields of sugarcane, volcanic ridges, and coral outcroppings that concealed fortified positions. Every advance was contested, every step forward met with sniper fire, hidden mortars, or sudden ambushes from men who refused to surrender. General Holland Smith, leading the American land forces, understood the magnitude of the task. Saipan was not just another Pacific outpost. Its capture would place U.S. B-29 bombers within striking distance of Tokyo. The Japanese High Command knew this as well, and General Yoshitsugu Saito's garrison fought with a determination born of desperation. For the defenders, the struggle was no longer simply about holding an island. It was about protecting the very heart of the empire. On June 19th, the battle briefly shifted beyond the island itself. As American troops pushed forward, the Imperial Japanese Navy launched a massive counterstroke in the surrounding seas, the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Carriers clashed in the largest aerial engagement of the war, remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Hundreds of Japanese aircraft were destroyed, crippling the fleet's ability to support Saipan. While this naval battle raged offshore, the Marines and soldiers on land continued their grim advance, unaware that the enemy's last chance to alter the campaign had collapsed. Back on Saipan, June 20th and 21 saw bitter fighting for Mount Tapochau, the island's highest point. Rising like a fortress in the center of the island, it commanded views of nearly every American position. Japanese artillery observers had used its slopes to direct deadly fire since the first landings. Scaling its ridges meant climbing through caves filled with machine guns and defenders who fought until the very last. The mountain was finally secured after days of hand-to-hand combat, flamethrowers clearing tunnels, and grenades blasting apart stone bunkers. Its capture broke the backbone of Japanese defensive coordination. By June 22nd, the Americans had split the island in two, cutting Japanese forces into isolated pockets. Supply lines for the defenders collapsed, and the constant pounding from naval guns and aircraft turned once impregnable strongholds into rubble. Yet, despite their losses, the Japanese refused to yield. Every cave became a fortress, every ravine a trap, as Saipan descended into a grinding battle of attrition. On June 23rd, the Marines pushed northward, their lines stretching toward the last great defensive belts. Exhaustion, heat, and casualties mounted on both sides, but the strategic tide had turned irreversibly. The U.S. held the initiative, while Saito's army prepared for what they knew would be a fight to the death. By June 24, 1944, the battle for Saipan entered its most harrowing phase. With the island effectively cut in half, Japanese forces under General Saito withdrew north, determined to make their final stand in the rugged highlands and cliffs overlooking the sea. For the U.S. Marines and Army troops pressing forward, the terrain became more punishing. Dense vegetation, jagged rocks, and cave networks offered perfect cover for defenders who fought with a tenacity that defied their dwindling numbers. Progress was slow, measured in yards gained at the cost of dozens of lives. The Americans brought overwhelming firepower to bear. Naval vessels offshore unleashed constant bombardments, while artillery units pounded ridge lines suspected of hiding machine guns. Yet the Japanese adapted, retreating into tunnels and re-emerging after barrages to strike unexpectedly. Soldiers armed with grenades and bayonets launched sudden banzai attacks that often broke through forward positions before being repelled. The result was a cycle of brutal close-quarter battles that drained both attacker and defender. It was during this stage that the human cost of the battle became unmistakable. On June 25th and 26th, American troops advancing through villages encountered thousands of terrified civilians caught between the two armies. Many were Okinawan and Korean laborers forced to work under Japanese control. Propaganda had convinced many that capture by Americans meant certain death, leading to scenes of despair. Families hid in caves or clung to cliffs, unwilling to surrender. Marines attempted to reassure them, but fear and indoctrination often won out, creating one of the darkest chapters of the campaign. As June gave way to July, Japanese resistance grew increasingly desperate. Ammunition and rations were nearly gone, yet units fought as though each skirmish might alter the outcome. General Saito himself issued orders declaring that surrender was unacceptable, instructing his men to sacrifice themselves for the emperor. The defenders dug into the last natural fortress on the island, the cliffs and ravines of northern Saipan. These positions turned into deadly strongholds, forcing the Americans into costly assaults with flamethrowers, satchel charges, and relentless airstrikes. On July 3rd and 4th, the northern push culminated in battles that revealed both the exhaustion and determination of the American troops. The 4th Marine Division advanced across Tanapag Plain under constant sniper fire, while the 2nd Marine Division fought to clear caves packed with fanatical defenders. Army units reinforced the effort, combining infantry attacks with tank support to crush strongpoints. Each advance brought them closer to the cliffs above Marpi Point, the last redoubt where thousands of soldiers and civilians were trapped. By July 5th, the Japanese command structure had collapsed. Starvation, disease, and constant bombardment left their forces shattered. Still, the survivors prepared for one last effort to resist. General Saito, gravely ill and unable to continue, issued his final orders for a massive counterattack. The stage was set for the largest banzai charge of the Pacific War. On the night of July 6, 1944, the Japanese garrison of Saipan prepared for its last act. With food gone, ammunition nearly exhausted, and the command in ruins, General Yoshitsugu Saito, unable to continue, gave his final instructions. His words called for every remaining soldier to die honorably in one massive assault, carrying with them as many enemies as possible. He then committed ritual suicide, leaving his troops to enact what would become one of the most infamous moments of the Pacific War. At dawn on July 7th, the silence was broken by the sound of drums, bugles, and battle cries. Approximately 4,000 Japanese soldiers, many of them wounded or armed only with bayonets lashed to sticks, surged forward in the largest banzai charge of World War II. They descended upon American positions of the 105th Infantry Regiment, overwhelming the first lines with sheer numbers and ferocity. Soldiers of the 1st and 2nd Battalions were caught in desperate hand-to-hand fighting as waves of attackers swept through machine gun nests and trench lines. For hours, the battlefield became a chaotic melee of bayonets, grenades, and rifle butts. Despite heavy losses, the Americans held firm. By mid-morning, reinforcements and concentrated artillery fire blunted the charge. Tanks moved forward to restore broken lines, mowing down the last groups of attackers who refused to retreat. When the assault finally ended, more than 3,000 Japanese soldiers lay dead, alongside hundreds of American casualties. The battlefield was littered with bodies, a stark reminder of the scale of sacrifice demanded by the defense of Saipan. In the following days, tragedy deepened. Thousands of civilians, driven by propaganda and fear of American occupation, sought death rather than capture. At Marpy Point, families leapt from the cliffs into the sea below, convinced it was their only escape. Marines and interpreters pleaded with loudspeakers, urging surrender and offering safety, but for many the warnings came too late. The Suicide Cliffs and Banzai Cliffs became lasting symbols of the human cost of the Pacific War. By July 9th, organized resistance was over. The island was declared secure, though isolated holdouts would continue fighting in caves for weeks. The cost of victory was immense. More than 29,000 Japanese dead, around 3,000 captured, and over 3,400 Americans killed with nearly 13,000 wounded. Saipan had been transformed from a Japanese bastion into an American stronghold, opening the way for B-29 bombers to strike the Japanese homeland for the first time. The Battle of Saipan was not only a tactical triumph, but also a turning point in the Pacific War. It shattered Japanese morale, exposed the vulnerability of their empire, and set the stage for the battles of the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. For both sides, Saipan marked the beginning of the end.